So this video will cover the smith-morra gambit. It will cover the basic setup of the smith-morra gambit, as well as some of the common traps that you should be aware of that can arise from the smith-morra gambit, and we'll also look at a couple of example games that were played with the smith-morra gambit. So let's begin. The smith-morra gambit is basically e4. It's in the Sicilian defense, so c5, d4, c takes on d4, and now c3. Usually black will take the pawn. If they don't, then you can very comfortably simply take and you have a very strong center, so they probably will take. Here you can take with your knight. There are maybe a fancy line bishop to c4, and this can kind of transpose into what is more commonly kind of seen as the Danish gambit. It isn't actually a Danish gambit because the pawn, usually it would be the e pawn that would go on this cycle, but you kind of get a Danish gambit-like setup. And so that's one way to take it, but the much more common and the way that we'll look at is knight to c3. Now your goal from here on is basically to develop as quickly as possible and to make it as hard for your opponent to develop as quickly as possible. So that could look like bishop to c4, knight to f3, castles, bishop to e3, queen to e2, and then the rooks can usually centralize and find home on the c and d file. And also the way that you're kind of restricting your opponent's development is that typically once the bishop comes to c4, your opponent is going to have a very passive setup that will be blocking in both of their bishops. And I'll show you why this is important for your opponent to do and what happens if they don't do this. So let's actually just look at one of the common traps immediately. So if they play knight to c6, you can develop your knight, they can develop their knight, you can develop your bishop, and here let's say they play d6. Opening up this bishop, looking to pin your knight and get some activity. Here, what you can immediately do is strike with the move e5. And it's actually already pretty dangerous. If they take with the knight, you can simply take, and after takes, bishop takes on f7, king takes, and you're winning the queen. This is a very similar idea to what is known as the Eric Rosen trap, where basically in the Eric Rosen trap, it is against d4, and it is this trap where you get a very similar idea. You're sacking a piece, you sack another piece, but by doing so you're dragging out the king, and the queen is left undefended. So you kind of get a very similar idea here, where you're dragging out the king, winning the queen. And so that's one way that you can immediately win a lot of material. And this is kind of why it's important usually for black to take a very passive setup with pawns on d6 and e6, so your bishop here is a little bit restricted, because otherwise this f7 pawn is just going to become a very, very big weakness for your opponent. Moves like knight to g5 can easily take advantage of that weakness, especially if they develop their knight early on and they can't put their knight on h6. But even if they can, the knight on h6 is a very passive piece. So the point that I'm trying to make is that typically they're going to have to get a very passive setup where both of their bishops are going to be locked in. Otherwise, these sort of traps are possible. Let's go ahead and look at another trap that can arise from the smith-morra gambit. So the second trap is actually going to be very similar to the first one, but we'll take a look at what happens if instead, in this position, they don't take with the knight and allow this bishop takes f7 idea. Instead, they take with the pawn. This is better for them because they're not losing the queen, but this is still not amazing. First of all, notice this does not work anymore, because if you take here, they can take and the knight defends the queen. So instead, you can just trade queens. Now, typically when you trade queens, if you're attacking, that means that most of your attack is going to dry away. But because of your massive lead of development here, that's not necessarily the case. And so here, immediately you can strike with knight to b5, threatening this fork. If they try to defend the fork this way, for example, then you can play knight takes e5, putting pressure onto f7, but also, very importantly, guarding this d7 square. So if they kick away your knight, well, you have checkmate, a very beautiful one as well. And so you just basically put a massive amount of pressure on them. And if somehow they find a defense, which the engine doesn't say that this is completely crushing. I mean, maybe there's some like king to d7 ideas here or something like that. But you can easily, whenever you want, castle, develop your bishop and get your rooks in to add even more pressure. And over time, this is going to build up and you're going to have a pretty massive attack here. And so that is kind of the second trap. It's very similar to the first one, but it kind of explores what happens if they take with the pawn instead of the knight. I will be going over one more trap that is completely different to any of these two. So the final trap I will go over is, of course, arising from the smith-morra gambit. You play c3 here, they take, you take with the knight. And here, sometimes they'll play e5. And the idea with e5 is to simply control the center and attempt to get a more reasonable pawn structure where your pawns are not going to be so passive on d7 and e7 or d6 and e7, and instead you're trying to grab a lot of space in the center and free up maybe your bishops in the future. The issue with this is because of white's lead in development, you can develop your bishop to c4, you can just develop your knight as well first and then put your bishop here. And the issue for black is white has a massive lead in development, so controlling the center is less of a priority and a bigger priority would be to stop white's attacks. And so here, if they play a random move, developing the bishop, you can play queen to d5 and immediately threaten checkmate, and the pawn on e5 no longer can come to e6, and black just has such a big lack of control here. You have such a massive lead in development. This is actually very bad for black. They can play d6 here, which is the best move according to the engine, giving the king an escape square, but you've completely infiltrated here. You can bring a knight into the mix, and the reason to do this would be if they play a random move, you have some sort of ideas of attacking the queen, encouraging this trade, and in the end you get this fork. But also here you can very simply take. Notice they cannot play bishop to f6, which is a very common way to kind of get out of this trouble where the bishop defends the rook defends the knight, and the knight defends the bishop, so kind of this trio to get out of the queen's attack. And instead this is a pretty powerful position for the queen, and this is just very crushing. So overall, you've completely infiltrated here. And what you've seen actually in all of these three traps is the pawn was either on e7 or e5. So the control over this diagonal was non-existent for black. And therefore your bishop was absolutely powerful and completely powerful. And this f7 square was a massive weakness for black. And so if you're playing against the smith-morra gambit as black, try to keep your pawn on e6 through the opening so you don't get trapped like this very quickly. And if you're playing as white, try to use this diagonal as quickly as possible. But even if they do correctly play e6, you still have a slower way to attack in the future. And that could look like developing your bishops, developing your knights, castling, getting your queen out, and then putting rooks, like I said, in the center files. And now we'll look at actually a few example games where there weren't necessarily these quick traps, but rather a longer process until white finally managed to win. So let's look at the first game. So here's the first game, e4, c5, d4, we have the smith-morra gambit, and here we have knight to c6, knight to f3, d6, bishop to c4, and now e6. And so e6, most likely, you won't have a very quick way to end the game. Instead, you're going to have to do what the white player did in this case and castle, take it more slowly, develop your pieces, get your queen to e2, and eventually put your rooks on the d and c file, which again are the ideal files because you have a pawn on e4, so putting it on the e file seems a bit unnecessary. You're not going to have much play on the e file, but on the d file you immediately have a target, and also maybe taking advantage of the pin in some cases. And so we have g5 here, which is a very explosive move. And what black decided to do here is black realized that he doesn't want white to have a very simple way to just develop their pieces and form a slow attack. And instead, black wants to be the one to initiate a massive attack on this king. So he starts to push his pawns and kick the knight away. And then after the knight moves to g6, the bishop comes to e3, he plays h5. And again, tries to, somehow try to chip away at these pawns and at this king over here. But this won't really work because white has just a massive lead in development. And so doing any sort of counterplay and counterattack is not going to be that successful. And here we see just that. Look at all these pieces here in the center of the board, and immediately white strikes with knight to b5. Targeting this d6 square, we have a6, knight takes. Notice that bishop took, and you might be thinking, aren't you just giving away a piece? But then immediately e5 can be played, pinning the bishop, taking advantage of the pin. And if knight takes, then knight to e4, adding more pressure to the bishop. Also, putting the knight on an ideal square in the center where in some cases it can stop this knight from having easy development. And the point is, you're completely crushing here. I mean, you have so much pressure on this position. In this game, the game continued in this position with queen to a5, not going for this knight takes e5 idea, and trying to activate the queen and get out of this pin in exchange for a piece. Obviously, white took the piece. You're up. You're up just a wonderful amount of material here, and you have still a very crushing position. So it's not like your position is starting to evaporate, and you can continue to attack. And so here, the really cool move knight to d5 was played, activating this knight, using this pin to white's advantage. If you take, then bishop d2 wins the queen, along with bishop to b6. So you can't really take. Instead, we have rook to c8, trying to activate the rook, but after knight to b6, defending the bishop, rook to c6, and now b4, hitting the queen. If the queen takes, then you can take here, and after takes, you can play rook to b1, activating the rook. So in exchange for this b pawn, you can activate the rook very quickly, and we just see a beautiful game here. Really, it's a very messy game, but overall, notice that all of these moves are working in white's favor because of the lead in development, and black does not have that same luxury. These pieces are just simply not as powerful as these ones over here. I'll show you how the game ended. We have knight takes, we have b5 here trying to open up the position, we have a trade, and look at this king on d6 so early on in the game. Queen to d2, bishop to d4, and now queen to e3, slowly marching forward. And I'll show you how the game ended. In the end, we did trade queens, but notice that you're trading into just a really nice position. Still, your bishops here are just really nicely cutting the king. You're threatening some checkmates even, and this is a very bad position here. Actually, in this position, black resigned because these checkmates are just very hard to get out of. This does not help. This is still going to be checkmate. And look at the difference in these knights compared to these bishops, which are actually attacking and putting pressure, whereas these knights are doing nothing to this king. So a really, really cool game. And it was pretty unsound in the sense that there was a lot of pawn sacrifices, a lot of weird-looking moves, but in the end of the day, you've just got to be comfortable to do these weird-looking moves if you're playing this opening, and you've just got to trust that you have so many pieces here that you're going to be coming out on top. So that was our first example game. We'll look at one more and then wrap up the video. The second game is just as beautiful as the first one. We have e4, we have the opening moves of the smith-morra. Both players develop their pieces, and again we see this e6 move, blunting the bishop, and trying to get out of the opening safely. Again, I encourage you here and recommend to just develop your pieces, castle, get your queens, get your king safe, develop your queen, and pile up slowly and slowly build an attack. That's exactly what white does here. We have knight to b5 here, a very effective move to just kick the queen away, and then h3 to kick the knight away. We have h5, which is a nice try if you take. Then after takes, the rook is being open here on the h-file. There's already a checkmating idea if you move the knight, and this is very uncomfortable for white actually. So instead of taking, simply e5, closing the gate on the queen. Now maybe threatening to take a bit, maybe the threat to take is a bit more justified now because the queen no longer is going to be threatening checkmate. But in general, the idea here is also to get this very nice square on d6 for your knight. So after a6, knight to d6, takes, you're giving away the pawn, but you're getting a nice and active rook the queen has to move, and now b3. And the point of b3 is seen a couple of moves later when white will play bishop to a3. And the idea is you are cutting the king from castling and keeping the king in the center. And while the king is kept in the center, ideas like bishop to d6 to d5 are possible because of the pin. And so if you can keep the king in the center of the board for as much as possible, that's what you want to do. And we see this again here with bishop to b7 and rook to c1, stopping the king from castling queenside, at least, you know, trying to not encourage that, because the rook will be aimed at the queen and the king here, and this could lead to a very unfortunate ending for black. And so you can see both with this development of the bishop and with the rook, you're trying to cover both of the castling ideas for black and stop black from castling at all, keeping the king in the center, in which case your very safe king and your massive amounts of development and piece collection here in the center and over the whole board will become very apparent. And that's exactly what happened. So queen to f4, bishop takes, and now bishop to d6, forcing the queen to be pretty misplaced here. You don't really want to trade. There are cases, like I showed, where trading is fine, but you don't have you haven't built enough of an attack to trade. So queen to b2, queen to g6, and now the knight tries to get a bit more active, and the queen centralizes, also defending the knight. And it's just pretty hard to find a move here for black. You can't castle and start using your rooks, again, because of the bishop here and the pressure you've built up on the c-file. So knight to d5, knight to f3, and black is kind of trying to just move around their pieces and try to get the most optimal defensive setup. But unfortunately, at this position, the whole position kind of snaps for black. Rook takes d5 and queen takes d5. A beautiful series. If e takes on d5, rook to e1, winning the queen back, because that's the only legal move, and it's just very dangerous. The best move is actually getting inside of the x-ray here, because if you go here, then knight to e5, and white is clearly crushing here. This is falling, this fork is hit, this is basically game over. That is why after queen takes, you don't take back and instead play f6 here, but this is not much better. Queen to b7, you get the rook in, and black tries to activate the rook this way because it's apparent that you're never going to be able to castle, and this bishop is just too much of a strong piece, but it's too late and it's too little. Knight to d4, you get your queen back centralized, and now king to f7, trying to castle artificially, but it doesn't work for a very nice tactical reason. Queen takes e6, taking advantage of the pin, and the knight defending the queen here. The king is, well, here in this position, I am pretty sure that black resigned, but the continuation would not be very nice, because after king to g6, rook can take on d7. You've built a ton of pressure here, all of your pieces working nicely together, and your king is completely safe here. So a really nice and beautiful game, showing you the power of keeping your opponent's king in the center and having that massive lead in development. Hopefully this video with the trap that I showed, with the example games that I told you about and I showed, hopefully you feel more comfortable playing the Smith-Morra Gambit. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.